Hi, I'm Ray Pointer,
And I'm Will Pointer.
and together we're the founders of ResearchWise AI. And today we're going to be talking about something that's called RAG. So, Will, what is RAG?
Thank you, Ray. RAG is what I would describe as a slightly unhelpful backronym for Retrieval Augmented Generation. Let's start with the end of that generation. That is the AI that we've all become used to since ChatGPT exploded onto the scene. It is a generative AI providing us answers to our questions or creating a poem or whatever we've asked it to generate. The retrieval augmented part, using words that we don't often use in English to make it inaccessible, is a part in which the rack system reads information, reads data, reads content just before it does the generation. And this content is often made to be more specific to answer its question. You may have seen ChatGPT can search the internet for an answer. This isn't actually often described as a RAG system, but it's a little bit similar to a RAG system in the sense that it's gone away and got additional context before it tried to generate an answer.
So, what does a RAG do? Why would somebody have a RAG?
There are a few different reasons to build a RAG system. First of all, you can control the source material that it's using more carefully. If a LLM is generating an answer from its general knowledge, its learnings, we know that it's much more prone to hallucination than a RAG system. We also don't know what it consumed to come up with that view. Now, some stuff we may be able to trust it quite reliably. If we asked it what is the formula for calculating standard deviation, it's probably going to do a fairly good job. But where there is much more gray zone, much more debate. It may come up with a less reliable answer, more hallucinations. With a RAG system, you can control the source of material it is reading. So you could, in the case of our stats example, you could hand it effectively a stats textbook, and therefore you can know that it's come brought its answer from there. And so if you trust the source material, you can then trust the output more. Additionally, and on top of trying to reduce hallucinations, another factor for using RAG is where there is no plausible reason the AI would know the answer anyway. An example might be internal company policies. If you're an HR department, you want a question answer bot to help staff get quick answers to HR issues, how to file maybe leave requests or how to claim expenses. These policies are not necessarily going to be documented on the internet, and you certainly wouldn't want the AI answering for another company's policies in an hallucination. Oh, I haven't found the policies for big tech A, but I found the policies for big tech B, and I'm going to pretend they're like the policies for big tech A. That's a nightmare scenario. So you want to constrain it to information here that is not on the internet, is not likely to have been in its original training.
So, if we ignore where it can search the internet as a RAG, are we talking about a database retrieval system?
Effectively, it will be a collection of documents. An example in my mind would be pages in a book. And so you would have something along the lines of a bit like a library and a very, very fast, intelligent librarian who, when you ask it a question, you're engaging in a conversation with the RAG system, will go and gather together pages from books, take photocopies if people still know what a photocopier is, of each of those pages, gather them together. The AI will read them and then start crafting an answer. And ideally, we wanted all that to happen in under a second.
So, what actually happens if I'm sitting there at a RAG and I type in a question? Um, so, I might be, we've got a disciplinary issue. What's the best way of tackling it and who should I notify? And I type that in. What happens next?
Absolutely. So in that case, the initial query, the question that you've asked, will be used to then search for other passages of text in the database that are similar. There's various different ways you can do similarity searching. It's common these days to do it with sort of vectors embedding, but you could just do it with words and stubbing. So looking for disciplinary and all versions of the word like disciplinary, and notification and so forth. So these keywords. And you gather together from the corpus of documents, so in this case, company policies and anything else, excerpts that are likely to be relevant to the AI. And then as a second step, you hand the AI these excerpts and your initial query and say, using these excerpts and ideally these excerpts alone, try and answer this query.
So now just jumping to sort of the market research world, if we've got lots of material from previous studies, where a client maybe, we've done lots of projects, and then we ask a question and we're in the coffee business. So what sort of variations might people be looking for in lattes or something? It's going to go out, find some sources, and then use an AI to read those sources and generate an answer. Is that basically the process?
Yes, exactly. That could be the process for accessing market research findings using a RAG system. You want to ask it a query, it finds whether it has got relevant findings, insights, even quotes from respondents in its database, and starts to pull them together to answer that query.
So, how is the rag made?
Well, it depends how technical you'd like me to go. First of all, you need to know what your corpus of content is. So let's use a collection of market research findings. Challenge me slightly to be make sure that it's highly relevant to our area of discussion. And you take each of those findings, whether they are presentations, insights, or whether they are the responses themselves, and you index them, first of all. So you scan over them and you create a representation of what is effectively inside them, a sort of fingerprint of the document or its key themes. And you create this index with all these different excerpts, and that's then ready to go for when you get those queries in to try and find the excerpts that are most relevant. And that's really important. How quickly can you find relevant excerpts? That's the initial stage. So you first, when someone hands in a query, it does that indexing of the query and compares the vector of the query with the vector of vectors in the database to find the documents that make the most sense. And once those have all been gathered together, they're handed as a sort of transient context to the AI to say, read these documents and then answer this question.
So, when you say vector, that's the process where we take some text, like a verbatim from a person, and it turns it into a string of numbers, and then we take a question from me, which is in words, and we turn that into another string of numbers, and then the system looks at these strings of numbers to see if they relate to each other. Is that right?
It is right. If we take it down to a very simple set of string of numbers, if we can imagine an XY chart, the sort of that we've seen in school, each sentence, each passage of text that we turn into vectors represents a line on that chart. And if you've got a sentence that's got a line here and a sentence that's got a line here, what we can say is that these are somewhat similar. They're not too far away from each other. They are not as similar as these two, and they're much more similar than these two. And although that is a very basic example
Mhm.
with only two dimensions per vector and only two vectors, in the case of some of these RAGs, they're working with 3,000 dimensions per vector, and they're working over millions, if not billions, of vectors in hopefully a fraction of a second. So it's a much more challenging space to work in for the technology.
So, let's say we've built a RAG and it's based on the research projects we've done in the past. How is it updated?
Effectively, updating a RAG is a relatively simple exercise of indexing the newest documents and adding them to the database. And that's another reason where, another area where I should have highlighted that RAG can be useful is that generative AIs, frontier models, foundation models have cutoff dates of their training. So because they are trained with a data set, and that data set has to have a cutoff date to then start the process of training and cleaning and so forth. For instance, ChatGPT doesn't know anything about the 2024 presidential election race in the US. He knows nothing about the UK elections and so forth, and the current elections that are happening right now. But a RAG system can be continuously updated. The database can continuously updated. So if you have a pipeline for collecting news articles, cleaning them appropriately, and then adding them to the RAG database, you could create an AI that can talk about what was happening yesterday.
Excellent. So, what are the pluses and the minuses of using a RAG, do you think?
To start with, one of the minuses of using a RAG is they are, and actually a positive and a negative. A positive is they are relatively easy to understand and explain compared to lots of the other AI world, which is useful for things like this and get people getting their heads around it. The drawback is that whenever people tend to understand an AI technology, it seems to be dismissed as no longer being AI technology because they can get their head around how it's working. So, RAG is both very impressive and very powerful and can be perhaps overly dismissed as not ambitious enough, even if it is useful for the actual use case. Real positives is it is much easier, in my opinion, to reduce and control hallucinations with the RAG system. Not only does it not hallucinate as much in the first instance, assuming it's got relative and useful content, if it does hallucinate, you can use additional layers of protection to check the source material and its hallucinated output and say, do these things tally? That's much harder to do when it's been trained on the widest internet and it's you go, well, where is your source material? And you've got to really positively conclude there is no source material and therefore it must be an hallucination. Whereby if it's RAG, you've got a much smaller database to go, hang on a second, there is no mention of that analysis method anywhere in the database. So
Mhm.
how on earth have you answered a question about it? That's definitely one of the pros. A con is that its knowledge is limited. All AIs, their knowledge is limited, but is much, much more limited. Even if you were to spend a lot of time and energy building a comprehensive database of facts and figures, there is always going to be more that is not in your database. Even if you were to consume the entire of Wikipedia, much of the world is still not captured in Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is already a vast, vast database. So whatever you create, you can control it more, but it will not necessarily do well when it wanders out of that area. Now, you could use its general knowledge and searching the internet as a fallback, and that might be appropriate for some use cases. But yet again, we really wouldn't want that if it was going to be an HR assistant commenting on company policy. Because if it doesn't have a policy, no company that I'm aware of would like the AI to start making up policies or borrowing them from other companies.
So, we're experimenting. We've got a beta version out there at the moment of a thing called Virtual Ray. Do you want to explain how we built Virtual Ray?
Yeah, so I think building is probably the right way to describe it. It's still very ongoing. For those that aren't aware, it's been out for about a week in sort of open beta testing now. We built Virtual Ray, its first version, using your blog posts. So this was the initial corpus of material, about 500 blog posts that you've written that we've then chunked up into separate excerpts that are supposed to be semantically meaningful, index them, and then they create the source material for the AI to search, then answer questions. And therefore, that is one reason in the testing that it often doesn't come up with an answer, is because although the answer is knowable, in these cases often, we're not allowing any general knowledge it has learnt. We're not allowing it to search the internet. So if you, Ray, have not written a blog about it, it can't answer the question. Even if Ray does know the answer, it doesn't know all the things that you know. It only knows what you've written blogs about. Additionally, one of the reasons we've taken this approach, rather than just simply taking a foundation model, adding a bit of knowledge to it, and allowing it to answer as best as it can, allowing hallucinations, we've taken an approach instead to have additional layers of AI, which then, once it has generated an answer, goes back and checks the source material and effectively marks the work. And if the mark isn't a good grade, that answer is rejected as probably being hallucination and it doesn't get to the user. And then there's additional checks even to say how useful the answer is. So, okay, it might be in the source material, but doesn't actually, so it's not hallucination, but it also doesn't answer the user's question. That sometimes happens and also gets rejected. So we've built essentially a multi-agent RAG system that works over your blog posts, and we've got aspirations to include more of your content from LinkedIn and webinar videos, podcast recordings, and everything else that you've created.
So we've one of the questions I noted that it couldn't answer, for instance, was what is the central limit theorem, which is something I've never blogged about, but I have taught when I've been teaching stats classes. So if I bring up my old stats notes and we embed those, then it'll be able to answer more of those types of questions as well going forward. Final question around RAGs in general, probably also in terms of how foundation models are created. How is the recency of information? So, if we take something like my attitude towards AI 20 years ago, which is it's got a long way to go before it's useful, and my attitude now, which is it's now very useful, how does it make sense of the different dates of the information? Or could it make sense in the future of different dates?
So you've challenged me here with a question that I don't entirely have an answer to. It can absolutely be done, and we at ResearchWise AI have a plan to do it. And I've got several different models by which it can be achieved, but effectively, we need to weight the source material by its relevance. And at the moment, its relevance is all done by, and for those who are watching on the video stream, I did this hand gesture to describe the angle between two different vectors in space. At the moment, its relevance is purely deemed by how similar the excerpt is to the question. And what we would like to do is add an extra weighting dimension, which is how similar it is, but also how new it is. And therefore, if you have written a more recent view on synthetic data, on advanced qual techniques, on the priority of using mobile market research, something that will have changed over the last 20, 25 years, it will lean towards using the newer sources. How you choose to weight that and how you communicate the weightings to the AI are slightly are open questions for different interpretations on how to achieve it.
Thanks, Will. I think that's probably covered everything that we need to know for the moment on RAGs. As you mentioned earlier, sometimes they're dismissed a little bit, but I think they are going to be a real workhorse of how AI is employed in a wide range of industries, including ours.
I agree, and they can work in many different areas, in my opinion. So a rag is exactly what we want. If you would like in the morning to say to your personal AI, whether that's Siri or Google's one or whatever it is, what do I have on today? You want it to read your calendar and then come up with a synthesized response. And that is the that is the correct tool for the correct job. There is no problem using RAG there, and so the dismissal of it them at times can be a little bit odd in my eyes. Also, a word about Virtual Ray, which I say has been tested, open testing for about a week now. Thank you to everyone who has been testing it. We are making changes on a near daily basis. So, if you're interested in what we're doing, please check in again, see how the answers are evolving, whether it's doing a better job of answering questions.
Okay, bye from me.
And bye from me.